Okay. So my starting point for thinking about gender identity propaganda was reading two books. First, Kajsa Ekman's book, Being and Being Bought, and second, Gail Dines' book, Pornland. Both do a great job of explaining the way that language has been used manipulatively to shape the way people understand and feel about social practices that are and have been harmful to women. These are all new applications of an old idea. So Mary Daly was writing in Beyond God the Father in 1973 about patriarchal language and the way it perpetuated sex caste hierarchy, and arguing that we needed to invent a new lexicon in order to achieve feminist aims. So while Ekman and Dines were concerned with the language used to talk about pornography and prostitution, I'm going to be interested here in the language used to do gender identity activism. And in particular, I want to talk to you about the way that some language used gender...
So what do you want to do?
What is happening? Identity. In particular, I want to talk to you about the way that some of the language used in gender identity activism has functioned as anti-feminist propaganda, painting women who are reasonably concerned about a range of real conflicts of interest as instead being exclusionary, hateful, bigoted, anti-science, and worse. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think if we're all more aware of what the language is doing, we'll be in a better position to challenge it and ultimately to refute it. So let me start with a general account of propaganda. So Cheryl Ross, in her 2002 paper, Understanding Propaganda, noted that propaganda is associated often with lies, appeals to emotion, and psychological manipulation. She thought other theorists of propaganda at the time had been too focused on how propaganda bypasses reason by appealing to the emotions. So for example, here is the Institute for Propaganda Analysis from a 1938 pamphlet, which she quotes. I'm going to do it dramatically because it's dramatic. Our emotion is the stuff with which the propagandist works. Without it, they are helpless. With it, harnessing it to their purposes, they can make us glow with pride or burn with hatred. They can make us zealots on behalf of the program they espouse. What we mean is that the intelligent citizen does not want propagandists to utilize his emotions, even to the attainment of good ends without knowing what is going on. So on the Institute's view, the propagandist is the puppet master, pulling at people's strings through the manipulation of their emotions. And this is wrong because people have a right not to be manipulated, to be instead told the truth so that they can make a rational decision about what political causes they want to support. Okay, but Ross thought that there was more to what is bad about propaganda than just lies and emotional manipulation. So first, she argued that the view got things wrong by suggesting that the propagandist uses emotion instead of reason, as though emotion and reason are entirely separate. Sometimes particular emotions are reasonable. So in her account, the focus is on instead how the propagandist elicits inappropriate emotional responses. So the propagandist might lie that some state of affairs happened, and then people might have an emotional response to that would have been appropriate had the thing actually happened. So then the thing is not the problem is not the emotions, the problem is the lie. Second, one can be manipulative with reason alone. So Ross quotes Bertrand Russell as writing that, and I quote, "Someone clever could frame a sufficiently clever argument in favor of any position." So a clever argument made up of entirely false claims might wrongly persuade someone. There's no emotion there at all, but there still seems to be propaganda. So Ross thinks it's located in the false claims because the argument can convince someone of something they would never have accepted had they known that some of the claims involved in it were untrue. And then thirdly, and finally, the propagandist is surely not always a liar. So the first reason for this is that the propagandists themselves might believe the false claims. So they might spread falsehoods, yet not with any intention to deceive or to manipulate others. And the second is that lying can be counterproductive to the cause. If the lies are discovered, this puts the propagandist's credibility in question. So what's a better, more expansive account of propaganda that doesn't have these problems? On Ross's account, what's of central importance is that there's some defect in the claims that are made by the propagandist. So they might make false claims, use bad arguments, deploy flawed concepts, or rely on unfair or unreasonable moral rules. So in Ross's view, in sum, propaganda is an epistemically, which means to do with our knowledge or our beliefs, an epistemically defective message used with the intention to persuade a socially significant group of people on behalf of a political institution, organization, or cause. And one example of propaganda that she gives in her paper comes from a 1990 US Senate campaign in which an African-American candidate was running against the incumbent, a white candidate. The white candidate ran an ad showing a pair of white male hands, these are the actual hands from the actual ad, crumpling up a job rejection letter with the voiceover, "You needed that job and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair?" The African-American candidate was on the record as opposing racial quotas. The ad falsely claimed that he supported them, and that the white candidate, in contrast, opposed them. The white candidate was re-elected, and the ad was believed to be crucial to his success. Okay, now we're in a position to look at where specifically anti-feminist propaganda shows up in gender identity activism. So let's start with a couple of dramatic examples that will illustrate Ross's point about it not being emotions per se, but inappropriate emotional responses that are relevant to propaganda. So I wanted to start with the razor blades hidden under stickers claim. So as Joe Bartosh reported for Lesbian and Gay News last year, the Northern Irish LGBT charity Rainbow Project tweeted out this message: "We have been made aware of transphobic stickers being put up around Belfast. Please take a pic and report this directly to ourselves. Try to remove them safely, but use a tool to do so, as we have been made aware of razor blades being placed behind them." The Lord Mayor of Belfast retweeted this, and as Bartosh puts it, outrage flared on social media. There has been no evidence provided of such razor blades in fact existing, and a spokeswoman from a gender-critical organization contacted the police to ask whether there had been any reports of razor blades under stickers, which of course there had not. So if gender-critical feminists had been going around putting razor blades under stickers, of course it would be appropriate to have a strong emotional reaction to that. Causing people to get their fingers sliced open for trying to remove political messaging is repugnant. The idea that there are razor blades under gender-critical stickers is false information disseminated by gender identity activists in order to elicit what would be an appropriate emotional response to correct information. So that emotional response, outrage against gender-critical feminists, helps to bring supporters to the gender identity activist side and to strengthen commitment from people who are already allied with that side. Okay, second dramatic example. Comparisons to genocide. Here's a little bit of an article from an article by a philosopher, Mark Lantz, writing for Inside Higher Ed in 2019. I'm going to sort of skip ahead a bit so that the arrows are where I am. He writes, in 1702, the New England Puritan Cotton Mather, skip a bit, asserted that the heathen savages that Europeans had met here were probably put here by the devil, likely lacked souls, were more akin to beasts than humans, and absolutely must at least be converted, and if not, removed, i.e. killed. Skip on a little bit more. At the dawn of the 18th century, as a mass influx of Europeans are launching one of the largest campaigns of ethnic cleansing and genocide in human history, these remarks are violence. They are an endorsement of genocide and played a very real role in facilitating it. Next paragraph, recently, a small but highly visible group of scholars has taken to arguing against the growing acceptance of the gender self-identifications of trans people, insisting that trans women are really men, trans men are really women, trans lesbians are really heterosexual men, and so forth, and often explicitly presenting these arguments as support for legal efforts to restrict trans folks' access to public spaces. Lance doesn't come right out and say that gender critical views are genocidal. He slightly backs off that claim by saying, I do not suggest that the current situation around TERF philosophers is as grim as the genocide of Native Americans. Obviously, there are differences of quantity and some of content between what happened to Native Americans in the 1700s and what's occurring in academia today. Well, thanks, Mark. That's very generous. The differences of quantity and content, of course, being that Mather was literally advocating for the killing of Indigenous people if they couldn't be converted to Puritanism, while gender-critical feminists are advocating for the maintenance of sex-segregated spaces on the grounds that sex and gender identity are not the same thing. So again, this is a mobilizing of emotion. Oh, no, we're going to go too far. Okay. No, I think that's right. Thank you. So this is a mobilizing of emotion. Here it's outrage, anger, and disgust at racism, imperialism, and violence. These emotions, of course, are appropriate to genocide, but they're entirely inappropriate to gender-critical feminism. So the analogy is propagandistic. This move also takes a slightly different form, which I find very interesting as a philosopher, in the accusation that in questioning gender identity, gender-critical feminists are denying a person's existence, which tends to slide into wanting/wishing for there not to exist, which tends to slide into kind of like wanting a trans genocide. So this tweet was just the top result when I entered genocide plus trans into the Twitter search bar yesterday. And it's talking about a state government move in Texas to prevent the surgical transitioning of children. So this slide from a precautionary approach to identity claims, especially in children, to an accusation of genocide is underpinned by an incredibly implausible philosophical claim. It's something like the claim, okay, that says man gender identity. It's something like the claim, my specific gender identity is so important to my sense of self that were I not to have it, then I would not be who I am. I, this self, would cease to exist and some other self would exist instead. So if you cause me not to have this gender identity, then you cause me not to exist. That's the philosophical claim. Of course, the embodied person with most of the properties that they had before is still standing right in front of you and no violence has been done. So if you think about replacing some other aspects of identity instead of gender identity in this claim, like being a Christian or being a mother or being a child prodigy violinist, it sounds absolutely absurd. So of course, you could have become an atheist, right, instead of a Christian, or decided not to have children instead of being a mother, or taken up team sports instead of being a child prodigy violinist. So we can have an interesting philosophical discussion about selfhood and identity, but disagreeing with some claim that exists within that debate doesn't put you anywhere in the ballpark of genocide. Okay, you might agree with me that some of these examples count as propaganda, but you might have the objection, well, this kind of manipulative disinformation, it's only put out by a few bad eggs. It's not central to the ideology of gender identity activism. There are bad eggs on both sides, you might think. They cancel each other out. So let me move to an example that's closer to the heart of gender identity activist campaigning. Inclusion. So there are so many examples that I could have given here because I think inclusion is possibly the key word of those pushing to have gender identity replace sex in law and policy. But because Senator Chandler is our keynote speaker, and because there was a protest outside targeting her bill, and because this article from Wednesday's Tasmanian Times talks about the bill and the protest and the event, I've chosen to use it as illustrative. So the headline, as you see, refers to Senator Chandler's Trans Exclusion Bill. Variants of the word inclusion appear 5 times in the text of the article and once in the image of the open letter, which is at the bottom of the article. We are told, this week, Tasmanian women will unite in support of transgender inclusion in the article. And in the open letter at the bottom, we see, we, the undersigned, believe our community is stronger when it is inclusive, equal, and values the contributions of all its members. This idea of inclusion has been used especially in the domain of sport. It invokes the idea of popular kids in the playground leaving the weird kid out of their games, and then the protective teachers and parents coming along and urging the popular kids to be kind, to do the right thing, to make the weird kid feel included. Nothing very much is at stake. But as John Pike points out in this paper, in sport, inclusion is not the only and not even the most important value. There are also the values of safety and of fairness. Safety is particularly important in combat sports like rugby and football, and a lot is at stake. Injury to women players, places in elite sports for women players, for which there is a pipeline from amateur sports, and fair competition for women players at all levels. Pike notes in this paper that people tend to try to balance these different values out, but he argues that this is a bad approach. He says that authorities have basic duties that cannot be permissibly traded off. So he thinks that instead of balancing, we should put these values in priority order. Safety first, then fair competition next, then inclusion last. But if we do this, activists' cries that keeping males out of women's sport is not inclusive become far from compelling. There's a little bit of emotional bludgeoning going on with the inclusion rhetoric, but I think the more interesting move is that it's highly misleading when it comes to the facts of the disagreement. In Ross's terms from earlier, we have an epistemically defective message, and it's being used to persuade people to a political cause. It's simply not true that Senator Chandler's bill, or gender-critical feminism more generally, is trans exclusionary. Rather, it has a disagreement with gender identity activists over the classification of trans people for particular purposes. Gender identity activists want people classified by their identities. Gender-critical feminists want people classified by their sex, especially when it comes to things like sports and prisons where bodies matter a lot. Gender critical feminists include trans men and female non-binary people. Gender identity activists include anyone with a woman gender identity. No one on either side is excluding trans people per se. The final point I want to make on inclusion is that women have been excluded historically from sports, from public life, and from work. Part of the project of working on women's full inclusion involves taking special steps to encourage more women into areas where they have historically been excluded. Including men in those projects might jeopardize them, especially when doing so increases injury risk or creates unfairness. It is absolutely not the case that people who care about inclusion should want male trans athletes in women's sport, and people who hate inclusion should want women's sports for women. Rather, people who care about inclusion should be thinking carefully about how women's inclusion in male-dominated areas of life might be negatively impacted by the push to include trans people in the opposite sex categories because of their gender identities. So inclusion rhetoric is propagandistic, largely because it's so misleading. Okay, there are loads of other interesting examples that I don't have. Okay, sorry, that is late. One more. Yeah, so there are heaps of other interesting examples that I won't have time to talk about here. I just put some of them up for reference. Maybe I'll say quickly about the first, just to give an example. So there's the way that women fighting to maintain single-sex spaces tends to be portrayed as segregation, which means a dominant social group denying equal treatment or equal access to a marginalized group. And then this sets gender critical feminists up as the dominant or the oppressor. Whereas in reality, the fight for single-sex spaces is separation, which means a marginalized social group withdrawing from the dominant group in order to create solidarity and support. And it is a feminist move. So on that reading, it is males/men who are the dominant or the oppressor on the grounds of sex caste, and women who are marginalized. So using the word segregation invokes a whole history of racial domination to position trans women in a particular way, whereas using the word separation tells more of the truth about why feminists care about single-sex spaces. So although there's a lot more to say on this topic of gender identity propaganda, I'm hoping that what I've said already is enough, at least, to make you think more about how gender identity activists are pursuing their goals, and in particular about the misinformation and emotional manipulation that is going on in the course of what is actually a pretty ordinary conflict of interest between political groups. Thank you.